My name is Michael Waymeyer, and I'm with my friend and colleague, Michael Ward. I'm a professor at the University of Kansas. Michael's a professor at George Washington University, and about 25 years ago, Mike and I first met. He was the bureau chief for the Secondary Ed and Transition Services branch of the Office of Special Education Programs. And I was a newly hired project director on one of the initial model demonstration projects to promote self-determination. And in the we're going to go through, Mike's going to talk a little bit about the past 25 years. I'm going to do a summary of where we are and what the research tells us. And look back at those 25 years to see what we've learned and whether all this activity is warranted and merited. And then we're going to take a little bit of time and talk more specifically about employment and issues related to self-determination.
And what is self-determination is important.
Right. So, and then we'll sum it up and move on from there. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
The OSERS self-determination initiative began in 1988. It focused on system-wide activities and tried to promote service systems to include consumers with disabilities in decision-making. It sponsored a 1989 national conference to kind of flush out the issues and to make recommendations. It supported 26 model demonstration projects to identify and teach skills necessary for self-determination to youth. It also intended to develop a cadre of future leaders. Just to get the movement started, I came up with an original definition of self-determination as the attitudes which lead people to define goals for themselves and the ability to take initiative to achieve those goals. My colleague, Mike Waymeyer, came up with another definition in 1992. The attitudes and abilities required to act as the primary course of action in one's life and to make choices regarding one's actions free from undue external influence or interference. Self-determination involves the construct of autonomy, self-actualization, and self-regulation. A bunch of us get together later on and kind of develop a composite definition. Self-determined people use a combination of skills, knowledge, and beliefs that enable a person to engage in goal-directed, self-regulated, autonomous behavior. An understanding of one's strengths and limitations, together with the belief in oneself as capable and effective, are essential to self-determination.
So basically a description of what self-determined people are and do, in essence.
The OSEP initiative, like we said before, funded 26 model demonstration projects for youth. And if you look across all the projects, they develop student abilities regarding self-determination by focusing on characteristics, knowledge, and skills. And what was also important was to provide opportunities to practice and apply skills leading to enhanced self-determination. Out of these 26 model projects, it was obvious that it was important. So, when the state system change projects were funded from 1991 to 1995, they were encouraged to develop, implement, and improve systems to provide transition services for youth. And they were also required to focus on student empowerment, self-determination, and training, including the outreach to underrepresented youth and families to increase student involvement in the IEP planning groups, board and community meetings.
So Mike has talked a little bit about how this came about. I think it's an interesting history in that really our focus today on issues of self-determination really came out of the recognition by Mike and other leaders in transition in the late 80s that although the nation had been implementing some efforts to promote and enhance self-determination, to improve transition-related outcomes, there was something missing. And what was missing was the young person, him or herself. And so, these initiatives came out pretty much concurrent with the 1990 IDEA regulations, the transition mandates that also included what we talk about as the student involvement requirements, where students should be involved in their planning meeting if transition services are discussed.
And that was a direct result of what was named by the 26th model demonstration project.
Right.
That this was indeed important.
Right. So, so we've had the better part of 2 decades. So what do we know, and have those initial investments on the part of the U.S. Department of Education and the foresight of leaders like Mike paid off? So let me talk a bit about and try to synthesize what we know and what the research tells us about self-determination. And I'll end that with a quick overview of a couple of recent studies that have provided causal evidence for practices to promote self-determination. Just a quick update. Mike mentioned that in '92 we defined self-determination in a certain way, and over the years we've learned more about what it is that constitutes being self-determined and how to best understand the construct. We see self-determination as a dispositional characteristic. It's a characteristic that a person has, basically, manifests, and it's manifested as acting as the causal agent in one's life. And people who are causal agents in their lives make or cause things to happen in their lives. It's important to distinguish between self-determination and doing things independently, which many people confuse. Self-determination, the root is from the philosophical doctrine of determinism, which refers to causation. The philosophical doctrine of determinism is the idea that all things are caused. So really self-determination or self-determinism is about self-caused action versus somebody else, some other thing causing you to act in certain ways. And we think that self-determined people are causal agents in their lives, and they act in service to freely chosen goals. And self-determined actions function to enable a person to be the causal agent and to make things happen in his or her own life. So it's really about causing things and making things happen. It's about acting volitionally. Volitional action implies, though, an intentionality. Volitional refers to making conscious choices, and conscious choice implies both you're acting based on your preferences, your interests, your values, but you're doing so in a manner that's thoughtful, that's conscious. And of course, at the heart of that, as you've seen in a number of these early definitions and through today, is goal-oriented action. People who are self-determined set and work to achieve goals. And so lots of things that instructionally we can focus on for youth with disability. And I would point out that really most of what we're talking about is applicable for all adolescents. This is something that was particularly salient for people with disabilities who had fewer opportunities to experience, to learn how to become more self-determined and to act in a more self-determined manner. But these are knowledge and skills and opportunities that most youth need. So much of the work really over the last decade has been increasingly school-wide and with youth with and without disabilities. So in the 25 years since the OSEP model demonstration projects, there has been established a fairly substantive and still happily growing literature base that tells us something about self-determination and youth, young adults, and people with disabilities. So we pulled together some of these to try and synthesize this. And perhaps the starting point, and it was the starting point back in the early 90s, is that the literature is very clear that youth and young adults with disabilities are less self-determined than their non-disabled peers. And that has been established. It's been shown across populations, across number of studies. And the important thing, though, is not to assume that this is anything about the capacity of youth and young adults with disabilities to become self-determined. In fact, the research that I'll articulate here in a moment speaks clearly to the fact that young people, if provided adequate instruction, opportunities to learn, to practice skills, to engage in greater aspects of their lives, can indeed acquire the knowledge and skills that enables them to become more self-determined. So the fact that youth and young adults and adults with disabilities remain less self-determined than their non-disabled peers really speaks to the continuing lack of opportunity available in the lives of people with disabilities. And so the clarion call is to address those lack of opportunities and to be sure that people are supported to engage in all aspects of their lives, to learn the kinds of skills that enable them to become more self-determined. So So I think that finding, though, also speaks to the fact that this continues to be a critical area of instruction in schools. And I would assume as well into adulthood. Of course, we need to approach how we promote self-determination in adulthood differently than we do during school. There is a number of factors that have been shown to contribute to enhanced self-determination. Greater social skills, social abilities, adaptive behavior are related to more positive self-determination. One of the clear findings, and I think it speaks to the importance of this issue of opportunity, there have been a number of studies that have shown that the strongest predictor of self-determination status for young people and adults with disabilities are the choice opportunities that they have in their lives. This is a stronger predictor than, I'll talk about in a moment, IQ and other things that people think might be related to enhanced self-determination. But clearly, you know, and back to the limited self-determination of many Americans with disabilities, you know, the research is clear that the environments in which people with disabilities often live, learn, work, and play limit opportunities to make choices and to express preferences and to engage in activities that are related to personal autonomy.
I think traditionally people don't expect people with disabilities to make choices, and therefore choices are not made available to them.
Right. And right, the low expectations and you know, it's almost often sort of by omission. People don't intend necessarily to restrict those opportunities. So I've mentioned that, you know, there's evidence that particularly for people with cognitive disabilities, research constantly does show that there is a relationship between self-determination and measured IQ. But the fact of the matter is, the really surprising thing about that research is how relatively weak and potentially insignificant that relationship is. When we look at IQ as a predictor, again, issues pertaining to choice opportunity and you know, inclusion and where one lives, whether one lives in the community or in, you know, segregated settings, all of those play a much stronger role. And I emphasize that not because I think IQ is something that is all fired important, but it's what Mike says about expectations. People believe that people with cognitive impairments in fact can't be self-determined because specifically of, you know, issues relating to IQ, and it's simply not true.
But I also think it's related to all disabilities.
That's right.
That there's a tendency to say you're disabled and therefore you do not have to make choices.
Exactly, right. So multiple, in terms of the relationship between self-determination and transition-related outcomes, we know that there are multiple studies that show that one's self-determination status predicts membership, high self-determination status predicts membership in higher quality of life groups and lifestyle satisfaction. So enhanced self-determination contributes for more positive quality of life and lifestyle satisfaction. There has been several studies that have shown a positive correlation between more positive post-secondary outcomes, including better employment outcomes, greater independent living outcomes, and enhanced community inclusion for youth with disabilities who leave school as more self-determined young people. I'll come back to that in a moment, because within the last couple of years, that's just been correlational evidence, but we've now been able to provide causal evidence that this is the case. And as you would expect, people who are more self-determined, young adults who are more self-determined, are more engaged in personally valued recreation activities. Their research shows that there's a reciprocal relationship between self-determination and the degree of involvement in one's educational planning, that youth who are more self-determined are going to be more likely to be engaged in educational and transition planning, and likewise, that being engaged in transition and educational planning enhances self-determination. So it's that cycle, that reciprocal interaction, where if we can get young people engaged in planning their lives, they're going to enhance their self-determination, and they're going to be, in turn, more likely then to want to do so.
They want some degree of control over their own life.
They want to have, I'm not a big fan of the word control, but they want to have a voice, they want to make things happen in their lives, and at a level of advocacy, it is about having some control in your life. So we know, the research again has shown that youth 1 year after high school, youth who are more self-determined are more independent, they're more likely to live somewhere other than where they lived in high school 1 year. They're more likely to be employed for pay and achieve those kinds of outcomes. People with disabilities have, from the very part of this movement, if you will, beginning even earlier, but certainly with the conference that Mike talked about in 1989, multiple people with disabilities, Robert Williams, Nancy Ward, Mike Ward, a number of people talked about the importance of self-determination in their lives. And in fact, when you survey adults with disabilities and professionals and parents and family members, all three groups think that self-determination is important, but time and time again, adults with disabilities rank it as more important than do parents and family members or professionals. So again, I don't think that's, everyone thinks it's important, but people with disabilities have been consistent and about the critical importance of that. We've made progress in the past couple of decades with regard to integrating knowledge about what self-determination is and why it's important into the education system. Teachers who are working in special education really do report that they're familiar with self-determination. They think it's important. They particularly think it's important to transition planning. There is different sets of beliefs based upon student characteristics that we need to continue to work to eliminate, really. Some issues around the severity of the student's cognitive impairment can impact what teachers believe is possible. And as I've said, parents of school-aged children believe that promoting self-determination is important, and by and large they report that their sons or daughters don't get enough instruction to promote self-determination. So as an educator, it's great to have parents and family members as allies. They can make things happen in terms of getting those kinds of changes. There are data to support the efficacy of a number of self-determination focused interventions, some of which came out of these early model demonstration projects, some of which have been developed since Alan Hoffman and Sharon Field developed the Steps to Self-Determination curriculum as part of one of those early model demonstration projects, and it continues to be used and have efficacy. Lori Powers and her colleagues take charge for the future, and a newer version of that called My Life, all which show effectiveness. The self-determined learning model of instruction is something that we've developed. It's self-regulated problem solving to enable students to self-regulate goal setting and problem solving. Moreover, there's a number of meta-analytic studies that have compiled the various meta-analyses that show that students with disabilities unequivocally can acquire, the types of skills and knowledge that enable them to become more self-determined. They can engage in choice making, they can learn decision-making skills, problem-solving skills, goal setting and attainment, self-advocacy skills, self-regulation, self-management, so on and so forth. We have strategies that we know how to enable young people to self-direct learning and to self-monitor and to self-evaluate. So there's clear evidence that students can acquire the skills and knowledge that lead them to be more self-determined, and if they do, they achieve more positive outcomes. And yet, there are still barriers. It's still the case that there are too few and often no goals related to self-determination in existing IEPs. There's limited effects and limited efforts to actually assess the effect of interventions. In my experience, strong quality programs to promote self-determination still in our country can be linked to individuals in a district. Somebody understands it and wants to make it happen, and when that person leaves, the effort sometimes goes away. There are barriers, the focus on, the perceived focus on content, core content as far as school reform has at least a perception of limiting focus on transition and related time. So, with regard to these issues of involvement in planning, we know that students are not involved in their educational planning by and large still. That remains the case. That students can learn to become involved if they do so. And that, as I've mentioned before, not only show enhanced participation and meeting-related skills, but also relationships between enhanced self-determination and student involvement. And there are a number of these student involvement programs that have been developed. Next Step by the folks out in Oregon, Self-Directed IEP, Jim Martin and his colleagues, Laura Marshall, the self-advocacy strategy, and our Whose Future Is It Anyway? So, when we started this 25 years ago, we didn't have a set of tools that we could give to teachers, and we do now. There are instructional strategies, packages, there are student involvement strategies and packages. Very quickly, I want to end this section by just stating the fact that we have causal evidence. We've done a couple of studies here lately. The first one was a 5-year longitudinal study. This is a randomized trial placebo control group study, 50 school districts, 493 middle and high school students across disability categories, and looking at, and our question was really, does intervention to promote self-determination actually do so? And it might seem a question that we don't have to ask, but in fact, there had been no studies prior to this that had provided, using randomized assignment and provided the kind of causal evidence. So all of the interventions that we could lay our hands on, we did everything we could to enable teachers who were working with students in the treatment group to engage with students and to promote self-determination. And what we found was that in fact, if you teach kids to become more self-determined, they do become more self-determined. And we had evidence of this on a couple of the measures of self-determination that we use. But the take-home message there is that young people who are provided instruction and opportunity in using these tools that we've just talked about learn, become more self-determined, acquire the knowledge and skills that related to that. We then followed these young people for 2 years after high school, and found that there was a significant positive effect for the youth in the treatment group, the youth who had received instruction to promote self-determination. They were causally predicted greater community inclusion 1 and 2 years postgraduate, and then employment 1 year post, and then employment at year 1 predicted employment at year 2. So what we've shown then is that if we can teach kids, young people, to become more self-determined, and they will become more self-determined, and then that's causally a link to more positive community inclusion and employment-related outcomes. And that's really important given what Mike's going to talk about here in a minute, the continued difficulties in terms of employment in our fields. Just a final, a second study. This was a shorter study, again randomized trial with in the neighborhood of 112 students with disabilities. These are students with learning disabilities and students with intellectual disabilities, so it was a smaller group. And they received only the intervention that I talked about earlier, the self-determined learning model of instruction, which is a way we developed to enable teachers fundamentally to teach students to teach themselves. So teachers support students to set an educational or transition-related goals, to create an action plan, and then to adjust the goal or the plan accordingly. And what we found was that youth who were receiving instruction using the self-determined learning model of instruction became more self-determined. I think one of the interesting things that this study showed was that we had 3 measurement periods at the beginning, at the end of the first year, and at the end of the second year. And it really took the 2 years before we began to see the positive effects that we were expecting. And I think that's something we don't talk about often enough. Too many of our efficacy studies are just kind of in 1 semester and out. So here we had an opportunity to stay with kids over 2 years, and it was between the first and second year that they finally acquired the skills using this intervention that enabled them to become more self-determined. Importantly, students in the treatment group, the self-determined learning model of instruction, had more positive academic or transition goal attainment than their peers in the control group, and had more positive access to the general education curriculum. And that's, I think, an important point. Young people who are more self-determined are, in fact, going to do better. I think it's, if you learn how to set goals, solve problems, organize, self-regulate, it's going to have impact not only later in life, but right there during school time. And then really importantly, in both cases that we measured, there were significant and really dramatic changes in teacher perceptions of what the student could do as a function of having been engaged with that intervention. And we've talked about expectations being something that really affect what people do. And I think it's, here we have the reciprocal benefit of teachers who are working with students to promote their self-determination, change their expectations based upon that experience, and raise their expectations and have more positive perceptions. So again, these findings, I would argue that we have as good evidence for the efficacy of promoting self-determination as we have for virtually any area in transition. And there's been too little work focused on issues of employment, but there has been some work. Mike can talk a little bit about some of these issues of employment and disability, where we are now, and then we'll come back to the role of self-determination in that.
As Michael suggested, people who are more self-determined have better outcomes, including employment. and create young people who acquire the skills to be more self-determined, have better outcomes. But I think it's important to understand that the majority of people with disabilities probably don't experience self-determination to the degree we would like them to. And therefore, if you look at the outcomes right now, they are not that good. This slide shows the prevalence rate of disability across the nation, and you can see that about 10.4% of the population indicates one or more disabilities. This is the prevalence rate across the nation, and I was surprised it's not uniform. Some areas of the country report a more higher rate, a much more higher rate than other parts of the country. That is the current employment rate of people with disabilities and people without disabilities, and there's a gap of 42.2%, which is huge.
It is huge.
About 21% of people with disabilities report some degree of employment, as opposed to about 56% of those without disabilities.
So that's full-time employment, right?
No, but yeah, I'm sorry, full-time for you.
So even though 33% are employed, only 20% of people with disabilities are employed in full-time work.
Right, and you can look at the slide and see the discrepancy according to different disability conditions. Again, the Great Depression of 2008 affected everyone, but it also affected people with disabilities to a proportional extent. People who are looking for work with a disability, only about 11%. Those without disabilities, 27%. These people on SSI, and it is broken down by disability. SSI is important because the current poverty level for a one-person household is about $11,670. If you take the monthly benefit of SSI, it's $721. So annually, it comes out to $8,652, which is way below the poverty level, which you can see by this next slide. 28% of people with disabilities live in poverty, but only 12.5% of people have. So there's a very high relationship between poverty and disability. Again, if you look at the Great Depression of 2008, our people are more in poverty today than 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and it's proportional for people with disabilities.
So, you know, we continue to struggle then in enabling and supporting people with disabilities to get meaningful jobs, to work at levels that enable them to live better quality lives. And far too many people with disabilities live lives that are described by poverty and by unemployment than is satisfactory. And we've described the evidence that shows that promoting self-determination enhances a number of important transition-related outcomes, but particularly employment and community inclusion. So we know that young people with disabilities who leave schools more self-determined. We know that they're more likely to be employed 1 year out of high school, and that's a causal relationship. And then other studies we've shown that students with disabilities who leave school as more self-determined young people at 3 years out of high school are more likely to be employed with a job with benefits, higher wages, and something other than that entry-level job that doesn't even get you out of poverty in many cases. And that self-determination status at graduation has a causal relationship with more positive employment outcomes 1 year and by virtue of that 2 years out of high school. So we know how to promote self-determination. We've done some work on a version of the self-determined learning model of instruction that's called the self-determined career development model. Again, it's enabling young people and adults to learn to set goals that relate to a career or a job, and to create an action plan to achieve those goals, and then to adjust their goal or action plan in order to achieve those outcomes. We're currently engaged through funding from NIDER in a large randomized trial study of the effect of the self-determined career development model in employment supports for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We worked some with the model within the context of the vocational rehabilitation system in several states, and in conjunction with independent living centers. We found that folks at centers for the independent living centers had the skill set to teach young people and adults with disabilities the skills that lead to greater independence, to employment, and that we could use them to facilitate the process, the self-determined career development model process, where the person with a disability actually sets their own employment-related goals and then creates basically a self-employment plan that then becomes part of what happens through the rehabilitation system. And we've got evidence that people who are engaged in this are able to achieve vocational related goals, and as I've said, we've been involved with activities to do that. I would say though that there is really far too little work in terms of the role of self-determination in employment, and part of that has just been that the funding stream has come out of public school research and not as much in employment-related things. We're doing some, and hopefully there'll be more of an effort. We have a website, a web portal for anyone who's interested, the National Gateway to Self-Determination. If you just go to ngsd.org, and we provide a lot of information on efforts to promote self-determination across multiple areas for multiple audiences. So more information on the self-determined career development model and what exists in terms of interventions that might be useful to promote employment-related outcomes. So we know where we are now, and we've talked a little bit about where we've been. So Mike's going to wrap us up by talking a bit about where do we go from here.
You're going to help.
And I'm going to butt in.
Yeah. Self-determination is not a model or program repeated predetermined services. One doesn't do self-determined. One doesn't do self-determination. One acquires the skills necessary. It's different from person to person. It's all about the self. It's all about the individual. Therefore, it person-centered and person-directed.
And I think one of the areas that we need to do a better job as we move forward is understanding how self-determination is operationalized in cultures and contexts that are more diverse. Because, again, I think people misunderstand what it means to be self-determined, and they equate it with making your own decision or living on your own with no help. And more than that, they equate it with certain ways that might be culturally presupposed of making decisions. But as I said earlier, self-determination is about self-caused action, and it really has nothing to do with how you make decisions. It has to do with your acting in ways that are consistent with what you prefer and that move you to valued outcomes. And so it doesn't really matter if you live in a culture or a context where decisions are made by a group, for example, rather than just a single person. It's that you've chosen to be in that context. And so I think in many cases, people from diverse communities feel left out of the discussion in terms of issues of self-determination because all they see is these applications, these strategies that tend to be equated with majority population. So, I very strongly believe that this issue of self-determination is relevant for all children and all youth around the world. It is a process. It's part of a process of individuation from going from being dependent upon somebody else, typically your family, to being largely dependent upon yourself. And wherever you look in the world, there are cultures and contexts that have that. So I think we need to have people do the work that shows how these issues play out in various contexts so that no child is left behind, if you will.
Again, self-determination is not something you do. It is not reflected in having choices or obtaining specific outcomes, which is what you just talked about.
Right. Yeah, and again, people often, I can remember several years ago there was an initiative to enable people with disabilities to purchase their own home, which is a great initiative, but people began to think that somehow that was equated with self-determination. But of course, being self-determined doesn't mean you own your home.
And all it is about owning your own home.
Right. You know, that's you know, until people with disabilities are homeowners at the same rate as people without disabilities, then we have a problem that needs to be addressed, and that's probably related to poverty and some of the issues we talked about. But you know, but whether you live in an apartment, you know, you live with your family, it's all about you acting volitionally in ways that are best to enable you to achieve the kind of goals that you want to. And if at some point in time, if that's owning your own home, then well and good. But much of the time, it's not. So again, you know, we're talking about people being volitional, acting based upon their own conscious choice.
Having choices and making decisions.
Right.
Choice requires three outcomes. A, B, and B is not A. Our choice is you want to go to a movie or not go to a movie. That is not a choice. And then there's always got to be something other than none of the above. What is it that you really want? What is it that you really want to do? Self-determination is about taking control over one's life to the extent possible or desired.
Yes, and you know, I think this issue of choice is an important component, but I think we, you know, the old issue of Hobson's choice, where the opportunity, the choice options available to many people with disabilities, none of them are any good. You know, the choice of whether you go to the institution or the group home, that's not a choice. There's no, you know, the answer there for many people is neither. I want a real life in the community.
And in order to have a choice, people gotta know what choices are available.
Right, and creating, you know, for young people with disabilities, among the most important things that can happen is that they just experience things so that they can learn what they like and they don't like. We were talking with a colleague last night who's a roller coaster fan. Michael is a roller coaster fan. I'm not. I don't care for roller coasters. But you really can't know how you feel about roller coasters until you've been on a roller coaster. And so, you know, so we need to work hard to provide young people with opportunities that teach them about what they do like, what's possible, and where they can go.
I think as we were talking, it dawned on me that having a disability has a certain set of challenges, and having and living in poverty also has a certain set of challenges, and the combination of the two often becomes overwhelming.
Yes, it's a double jeopardy, really.
But what we are saying is that those people who have the opportunity to be more self-determined may be better able to deal with those challenges and improve those outcomes.
It's linked to empowerment, and I think the way that the best way to empower a person with a disability is to enable them to empower themselves through these kinds of things. So Michael, 25 years from now, when we tape our next webinar on this topic, I think our hope is that we've continued to make progress and that some of these issues become things that we talk about as in the past and not present.
And also the percentage of people doing what they want to do, living good, meaningful, productive lives, have drastically improved. Thank you.